Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter. Sorry for this one being on a delay, but we've had a lot going on between actual research and also having a new kid that should be popping out just a few days from when I'm recording this. So, we've been busy. That said, let's get started with our look into May 2024 for paleontology, and the links will be below in the description. A tooth locality from the Portuzuelo Formation has been able to show a high diversity of theropods coming from this time in the Cretaceous in Argentina. And this is pretty interesting. There's a lot of different types. There's some from Alvarezsaurs, these weird little one-fingered animals that would have been running around and mostly eating small things. But then you also have larger animals. So you'd have some Abelisaurs and some Megaraptorans, both of which could reach pretty large sizes for theropods and were pretty dominant predators in their environments. Although this is one of the few cases where they actually overlap to a significant degree. Hopefully more research will be done on this formation because it does hold promise to hold some really interesting fossils, especially with the Megaraptorans. Hopefully we'll get a good one because most of the ones we have are pretty busted up. Staying in the Cretaceous but moving to the Gobi Desert, we have a bunch of rocks that are really poorly constrained and not necessarily understood as far as what their relationships to one another is. We know there's distinct groups, but we don't necessarily know how they line up with one another. This paper used an unmanned aerial vehicle, essentially a drone, to take photos of these rocks in really high definition, and from that be able to figure out a little bit of what the environment was like. For example, there's some times where there are stream beds within this area. However, there's also large aeolian sand dunes, meaning large wind-blown dunes. What this paper was able to do is show that those are not different layers, they actually intermingle quite a bit. Meaning you would have had this broad desert with this stream running through it. And so those are two really interesting methods papers, one just using the UAV to be able to understand the rocks better, and the other looking at all these different morphologies of teeth to show what these teeth are and how we can understand them better. However, there's also things that were looking more directly at the animals, including in this paper, which used ecological modeling to show that it's pretty likely that at least the ornithischians and the theropod dinosaurs became warm-blooded during the early Jurassic when things were cooler. And this makes sense. A lot of their fossils show up in the northern and southern parts of the world as opposed to being more equatorial. Then you can look at things like the sauropods and they are more equatorial. This means that their large sizes probably evolved near the equator. And then they were able to spread from there even occasionally into cold places, but they were not necessarily warm-blooded or endothermic. Instead they were ectothermic, taking in heat from their environment. The thing is though, when you're that large, you're able to basically be an endotherm anyway, because when you're that large, your muscle mass is already producing a lot of heat. So it's not necessarily the same producing the amount of heat that we see in mammals or even birds today. Instead it would have been a little bit different. It also means the sauropods were probably basically just homeostatic because of their size. They wouldn't change in temperature a whole lot. This also means they could tolerate a wide variety of temperatures, but just not necessarily super cold ones. It's really interesting to see how just one organism could adapt to so many different environments, and that's what this paper is suggesting. Kiyacursor longipes is a new species of ceratosaurian coming from Russia. And I say ceratosaurian here fairly loosely because it's not quite what you think of with Ceratosaurus or any of the other meat-eating ceratosaurs. Instead it would have been more herbivorous, closer to things like Lemusaurus. You can check out our video on that for more information on those. But it comes from this area of Russia that's been known to have a lot of Cretaceous fossils of things that we mostly find in the Jurassic, including things like stegosaurs. What this means is that this area of Russia was probably a refugium. Essentially, as these animals were dying out, they could still make a living at least in parts of the northern continents. Eventually, of course, they did all die out, and that's unfortunate for them, but it is interesting to see how this relict population of Jurassic animals survived pretty well into the Cretaceous. Birds are very diverse today, but they were also diverse before the KPG impact that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs, and a lot of them did suffer during that extinction. This paper looked at two different birds that have been found in the type section for the End Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian period, and these come from the Netherlands in the area of Maastricht, thus the name. First, we can look at Asteriornis, which is thought to be relatively closely related to chickens and ducks, and they actually were able to do histology, that is, cutting up the bones and looking for lines of arrested growth, where the animal would have gone through a tough season and eaten less, and then by extension, grown less. What they found is that there's not actually any lags, but it's still at least relatively large, and based on other parts of the skull, most of those bones had fused. Meaning this was probably a yearling Asteriornis. It wasn't necessarily fully grown or even over a year, but it was about that age. This is also really interesting though, because that means it was basically full size within 1 year of hatching. And that is something we do see in modern day birds, but we didn't necessarily expect to see it before the KPG impact. It was kind of thought that, hey, this rapid growth may have evolved because of that. That doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, it seems like these organisms were already growing very rapidly. And then you have Janavis, which would be on the lineage that would lead to birds, but just a different branch of it. And it actually is really closely related to the North American Ichthyornis, which is known for being a kind of seagull-like bird, but it still would have had teeth. It's very interesting. Janavis actually would have had a more pneumatized skeleton, meaning more air in the skeleton, and this is more like what we see in things like modern-day birds than it is in Ichthyornis, despite almost all of its other morphology saying, hey, it's more like Ichthyornis. What this means is what we think of as modern-day bird traits actually showed up multiple times in the lineage that would lead to birds. Avicranium is a genus named for its bird-like skull. There's just one problem with that. It's not a bird. It's not even closely related to birds. Instead, it was a reptile, and the whole group of animals related to it or with similar bird-like skulls have been referred to as the avicephalians and include things like the lectotypes in the Permian, but also things like the Trypanosaurs in the Triassic. So there's almost 50 and potentially even more like 65 million years separating these two groups. So it's thought potentially the Trypanosaurs evolved early and then just kind of hung out. This paper looked at these two groups of fossils and went, no, they're not actually closely related. What they found is that, yes, the lectotypes, as expected, were very early branching reptiles. Meanwhile, the Trypanosaurs were found to be pretty closely related to the archosauriforms, along with groups like the Trilophosaurids or Hendosaurids. This makes a lot of sense because it means there's not a 50 million year old gap in the fossil record. Instead, it just seems more like, hey, the Trypanosaurs popped up in the Triassic like most of the other reptiles that popped up in the Triassic. The Late Triassic of Wales has been one of the best places in Europe to find microfossils. And by microfossils, I mean essentially there would have been a small chasm in some parts of these rocks here, and then as sediment filled, little teeny tiny pieces of fossils got washed into and fossilized there. This is especially true of Lavernock in Wales, where most of the best fossils of Triassic dinosaurs coming from all of the UK are found. This paper tried to understand how this deposit is actually different from some of the other fissure fills that we get in other places in the UK. And what they were able to show is that there's actually a significant lack of things like shark teeth. It also suggests that potentially this is closer to shore, and that's really important when you're thinking about fossilization. Because most of the bones that actually do end up being found here are basically isolated. You might have a few of them on occasion, but they're also fairly rounded, meaning they did get transported from inland off the shore into these fissures that were then filled in by more mud. This means it's fundamentally just entirely different from what we would expect from most of these fissure fills, especially when there's no smaller fossils. Potentially even smaller fossils and things like shark teeth could have just been washed away by simple motions of the ocean going back and forth, essentially sifting out these smaller things, but the heavier rocks are able to stay there just because they're heavier. And the same thing would go for bones, where the bones stay there because they're larger and heavier, and that's why we have dinosaurs instead of very small early lizards like we have in some other sites in the UK. One of the groups in the Triassic is the temnospondyls, very closely related to amphibians, but also a good bit larger. For example, you can look at things like Anachisma from the US and go, yeah, that's much bigger than the largest salamander today. And it's not a salamander, but again, related. With recent research on aquatic ecosystems of the Triassic, though, it's been suggested that potentially India had this really neat system where it's highly endemic. Essentially, there's not a lot of migration into India or out of India by different groups. In the temnospondyls, though, this was shown to not really be true at all. Instead, what you find is India has a lot of very similar temnospondyl faunas to South Africa, and this makes sense. 200 some odd million years ago, India and Africa would have been connected. And then it's only later that India broke off as its own subcontinent, and you get really, really unique animals evolving there. And staying in the waters of the Triassic, we have the long-necked reptiles, things like Tanystropheus, which would have been bounding through the water and catching squid and fish. They're really interesting animals, and this paper was looking to see how they actually developed their long necks. And this is a really interesting concept that doesn't really seem like it on the surface, but once you look at it, it is. Because they had a lot of neck vertebrae, sometimes up to 13 or 14. Meanwhile, you look at really long-necked mammals, i.e. giraffes, they still only have 7 vertebrae, the same number as us. It's just each of those individual vertebrae lengthened quite a bit. In the case of things like Tanystropheus, it seems like that group of reptiles actually essentially lowered the shoulder girdle. Essentially, if you just pushed my shoulder straight down and all of the other vertebrae in here became neck vertebrae, that's what happened with them. which is really interesting to see some of these constraints. You can't just add in new vertebra directly to the neck. You need to instead take vertebrae that are already existing in the body and add them to the neck. So you're not creating a whole new thing, you're just modifying something that was already there. And that's the way evolution worked in this group. The bodies over time were able to slowly add extra vertebrae to their neck from the body cavity, and those essentially were also able to elongate the way you do see in giraffes, and that's part of how these animals were able to succeed in the water. Staying with Triassic long-necked animals, we're moving to a sauropodomorph named Musankwa sanyatiensis, coming from the late Triassic of Zimbabwe. It's known from just a single limb, but most of that limb is actually there and was articulated, meaning you could really see how the bones fit together. This is really unique and not something we normally see in the fossil record, because most of the time fossils just fall apart and they're kind of in the same area, but you need to really work to piece it together. Based on the phylogeny, it's actually pretty close to Temnospondyls, which is on the lineage leading to true sauropods, or Eusauropoda, which is what we normally think of when we think of sauropods, especially in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. This is one of those earlier groups that existed during the Triassic but didn't really make it through. Still though, it helps to show how some of the different limbs may have evolved, and hopefully there will be more work on this in the future, into what became the very stereotypical sauropod leg of being very columnar. Because a lot of these early ones, they weren't necessarily columnar. They would have definitely been able to hold up their weight, but not necessarily in the same strong, rigid fashion that we see in the massive, massive sauropods. And still in sauropodomorphs, we have Melanorosaurus, which was named in 1924, and unfortunately the holotype, the one that we base everything else that we know about the animal on, it's gone. It went missing, it fell apart, who knows what happened to it. But this paper essentially went, hey, we have really good descriptions of it, we can look at those descriptions and assign a new fossil as a lectotype, essentially a new holotype with which, when people find new fossils of sauropodomorphs, they can go, let's compare. It's not this. That's essentially all a lectotype or a holotype is. It's just a matter of which one was actually found first and do you have the original, the holotype. This is just really useful for understanding their broader evolution, and now we have something new that we can actually compare with, so we can actually put Melanorosaurus into different phylogenies. Plateosaurus for a long time was a wastebasket taxon, meaning anytime someone found a new sauropodomorph in Europe, they just went, yeah, it's Plateosaurus. Oh, this thing? Yeah, it's Plateosaurus. Oh, another one? Yeah, it's Plateosaurus. That's not really the case, and that's been shown with a couple of new papers. This paper, though, looked at the holotype of Plateosaurus, and from that they made a new phylogeny and found that it was really closely related to Unesaurus, which is really, really interesting, as Unesaurus is sometimes considered not a dinosaur, but if it is a dinosaur, it's arguably the earliest known one, which is really exciting that, hey, look, we have Plateosaurus showing that potentially, yeah, Unesaurus is a dinosaur, and that this sauropod lineage, or at least sauropodomorph lineage, is one of the earliest branching lineages in the dinosaur family tree. And then we can drop into true sauropods, in this case a titanosauriform coming from Argentina in the Aku Formation. This is really interesting for me because I play Dungeons & Dragons and it's been named Tiamat, which I know has other origins, but that's where I'm familiar with it from. As for its phylogeny, it pops out very, very early in the titanosaur family tree, which is also interesting when you consider its size. It wasn't the, 100-foot long behemoths that we think of with the titanosaurs. Instead, it was much more modestly sized, as you can see here. So it was a relatively small titanosaur that would have been living alongside some of these giants. And it really goes to show just how diverse they were in South America during the Cretaceous. As for other animals living in South America during the Cretaceous, we have Koleken inikeali, an abelisaur coming from the La Colonia Formation. This means it would have probably been living alongside Carnotaurus, an even larger abelisaur, and that there was a lot of diversity, at least in abelisaurs in South America, as far as different size classes that could live alongside one another. It also does seem like this Koleken was at least fairly close to adulthood, so it doesn't seem like it's just the opposite sex of Carnotaurus. Instead, it seems like it's something totally unique and different, and hopefully we'll get some more fossils of these organisms so we can really understand what they were doing, because they were clearly diversifying and occupying a lot of different niches, even alongside one another. The southernmost rocks containing the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, essentially when the impact happened, in South America were also studied. And this seems kind of minor because it's like, well, obviously it was terrible. It was near the impact site in Mexico, in the northern hemisphere, but still close to South America. The thing is, though, the impact came in at such an angle as to direct most of its force northwards. So South America may not have been as affected, and it's been debated a bit how much it was affected. What they found is not just the iridium spike showing that, yes, iridium, the cloud caused by this impact, got all the way to South America, but also a spore spike. Essentially, ferns were dropping a lot of spores, meaning that most of the rest of the forest had probably died out. This also tracks with what we see in the pollen, where below it you see more redwood-type forest with a lot of conifers, and above it you see much more angiosperm-dominated forests. So it's basically what we expected, but really nice to see. Again, it's been debated how much of an impact this impact had in South America, but this is able to show that yes, it truly was a global event that changed forests and ecosystems everywhere. As for a group that made it through that impact, we have the mammals. And this paper was just looking at how much they were speciating, and especially did they speciate before this extinction and impact happened, or afterwards. What they were able to find by looking at occurrences of different mammals throughout the late part of the Cretaceous is that, yeah, they were specifying a lot before the impact. So it's not necessarily that, hey, all the dinosaurs went extinct and now they can do things. They were already doing a lot of different things in their environment. And then the non-avian dinosaurs died out and they went, hey, look, free real estate, we can do this even more so. Solanotherium walshi is a new species of dryolested mammal coming from the Allen Formation in Argentina. This is from the early Cretaceous, and the dryolestids are extinct now, but help to highlight what I was just talking about, because they were very diverse and occupying a lot of different niches. This new fossil also helps to show that one of them, Microvertebrates, also wasn't actually a dryolestid as thought. Instead, it was a meridolestid. So you have two very different groups of mammals actually living in the same environment and doing different things. Again, highlighting that mammals were already diverse before the impact, and this is well before the impact they were diverse. And even monotremes were diverse during the Cretaceous. Monotremes being the mammals that lay eggs and produce milk via sweat glands as opposed to mammary glands. So think of things like the platypus and the echidna. This is really interesting though, because right now we only have a few species of platypi that are actually still around. This paper looked at fossils just from Lightning Ridge, Australia, and found 6 species total. Some of these had already been named, there's a few new ones, but it really goes to highlight that, yeah, this group that we think of as being really rare and unique, there was a lot more diversity even just for them in the fossil record. So it's really interesting to think about that, yeah, the monotremes were doing very well even when dinosaurs were around, and it's only up towards the modern day that they haven't been as successful. As for some of those that actually made it through the extinction, you have a new fossil species coming from Colorado just after the impact around coral bluffs, and that's Melodocodon lidae. It was a peritychid, a group of mammals that lived in the Paleogene just after the impact. And this one has fairly advanced teeth for its time just immediately after that impact, meaning that it's helping to show that this group is already pretty diverse before the impact, or at least right after the impact, they diversified very, very rapidly. So what it's really showing is just that, yeah, the mammals were already diversifying before this extinction, and then once they got to that extinction, they diversified even more in order to take over new niches, including as herbivores, as is the case with Melodocodon. Moving back to Australia though, you have the diprotodonts, which are big wombat relatives that would have walked around and eaten a lot of plants and had ever-growing incisors, a lot like rodents. Essentially, their incisors would never stop growing, that way they could keep chewing and snipping off branches and things. This study chemically analyzed many of their teeth and were able to find that there are signals for different things about their life history, such as their sex, but also just how old they were. So this will hopefully be used in the future so we can really understand what kind of role diprotodonts were actually playing in their environment and how important they were when you compare them to other herbivores that were around at the same time, such as giant kangaroos. So great paper that's going to help us understand these organisms a lot better in the future. Alright, quick pause, because if anything does look different, it's because we had a baby in between me recording the first half of this and the second half. So, yes, but also let's get going into the second half of this. And I was just talking about Diprotodon, which has teeth that grew throughout its life. And for other animals that had teeth that grow throughout their lives, you can look at rodents. In this case, porcupines. Porcupines have a lot of diversity within South America, and it's likely they originated there and then spread northwards. This is interesting because it's not what we normally think of with porcupines, at least in North America, because we can just go, oh yeah, we have the big North American porcupine. That must be what they're all like, when that's not really the case. Interestingly though, a new fossil of the same genus as the modern North American porcupine has been found, and it has some traits that do link it with South America. That's in part because South American porcupines often are climbing in trees a lot more, and sometimes even have prehensile tails that can grip onto branches. This new fossil of Erythazon actually has a tail more like those South American ones, where it is longer and likely at least somewhat prehensile. This is different from what you see in the modern, larger North American porcupine, where it has a much shorter tail. The fossil also comes from more temperate regions of North America, meaning that essentially, yeah, sure, it still has this South American trait, but it lived there and has other morphological features that align it with North American porcupines. So we're really starting to find some of these more transitional fossils that help to show different dispersal events in the fossil record. Genetics can also help us understand some of this though, and in this case we're looking at Camelus nablocki. Now, Camelus is actually the same genus that includes the modern day camels, that is the dromedary camel and the batrachian camel. This fossil is able to actually help us understand that they had a really complex evolutionary history. Because sure, nablocki is closer to the modern Bactrian camel, the two-humped camel. However, the genetics show that it's not necessarily as if they all split in distinct times. In fact, it actually suggests that they all split at around the same time, including the dromedary camel with just one hump. Now, based on the fossil record, it is still very likely that the dromedary camel did split earlier than these other two. However, also very importantly, there are other two-humped camels in the fossil record. And based on what we know of those, and with this new genetic study, they kind of just all split at once. We don't really know why suddenly there was this giant burst in diversity within the two-humped camels. It just kind of showed up. While the modern species of camels are often thought of as being both African and Asian, there's actually some groups, including camels, that actually had a Eurasian and African range. In this case, we're looking at the last known giraffe to come from Western Eurasia, specifically in Greece. This is really interesting because it helps to show that, yeah, they definitely survived in parts of Europe up until humans were actually starting to get there. Paleotragus inexpectatus is the last known of these European giraffes. And this paper used new fossils of it to actually show that it's not necessarily related to the African giraffes, which might have been closer, but instead to some giraffe fossils that are actually found in China. Meaning essentially that when you're looking at giraffe evolution, you need to understand that there are two different patterns showing up. There's the African pattern of the African populations that led to modern day giraffes, and there's the Eurasian pattern, essentially what was happening in Eurasia within this group. Looking at fossils that are pretty close to the modern day, there's also some very distinct sequences you can use with them. For example, you can think about river terracing, essentially when a river is on one level and dips down to the next one. And you can see this in some studies of the River Thames in the UK. These different paleoterraces of the River Thames in the UK have actually already been dated. But there's also fossils of things like bison, horses, and even elephantines, meaning essentially mammoths or mastodons. What this paper was trying to do is study those amino acids in those teeth to try and see if they could understand if, hey, maybe amino acids can actually also be a method for dating. And what they found is it actually does line up pretty well within all three of these groups. What this means is we can actually start to do some different testing with these kinds of fossils in other places to try and get good age estimates for when those fossils would have actually been deposited. It's also really interesting, and they bring this up a little bit, it's a river Thames, right? Like, there's going to be some freshwater animals in there, but also some animals moving from saltwater into freshwater, like seals, for example. And while that may not have been an always happening occurrence, it does mean that if we can start comparing those amino acids, we can start to make sure we're actually at the same time period within both of the marine realm and the freshwater terrestrial realm, and then compare those in other places and try and understand the dates there as well. There was also a study on cat and cat-like saber-toothed carnivorans coming from more recent fossils. And by that I mean it's the saber-toothed cats, but also things like the nimravids and the barbarophilids, which aren't cats, but were pretty closely related. The paper was basically just trying to say, hey, did all of these animals evolve the same traits because of the same pressures as they developed these saber-toothed teeth? What they found is there wasn't one kind of one-size-fits-all skull morphology for these different saber-toothed predators, despite being all fairly cat-like, even those that weren't cats. What this means is essentially it's not just one single pressure that led to saber teeth and very specific kill mechanisms in skull morphology. Instead, there was a variety of different morphologies that seem to have worked. As for the saber-toothed cats properly, Meganteron is another one of the genera that's been found pretty universally across Eurasia. And this paper was looking at some of the fossils of it coming from the foothills of the Himalaya mountains in parts of India. The main purpose of the study is to really categorize these fossils as just, hey, is it just generic Meganteron? Is it the same species even as some of those coming from Europe? Or is it unique? And what they found is, yes, it is unique, and it is a different species, even if it is in the same genus as the ones from Europe. One of the things that makes it really interesting as far as being its own species is just that it's larger than the European versions. So Meganteron falconeri, the one from India, is found to be a valid species, but also the European one, Meganteron coltridens, is also found to be a similar species, just smaller slightly. And this is interesting. It's showing a lot of diversity within the saber-toothed cats across Eurasia during the last 2 million years or so. But of course, having saber teeth also means you're going to have to change your lifestyle a bit, because those don't just grow overnight, instead it takes a lot of time. And that's the case in Smilodon, where we have a lot of juvenile fossils of Smilodon, meaning researchers could look at how its teeth were developing and not just the saber teeth to try and understand what they were doing. What they were able to find is that it's very likely that Smilodon juveniles stayed with the parents for much longer. And that's essentially because it would have been harder for them to hunt and develop those teeth without the support of an adult. So they also probably had a longer weaning period where essentially they were feeding on the mother's milk for longer than we see in modern day big cats. And on the subject of big cats and other large carnivores, we do have a paper that was looking at the last 20 million years or so in the Iberian Peninsula and looking at how different climatic changes actually changed the faunas that existed there. And what they found is it's not necessarily the environment itself that changed what animals were there hunting. Instead, it's the prey items that changed what animals were there hunting. So even if you have very similar forests, if one of them is dominated by small horses and the other by deer, you're going to get different predators. And you can see these different faunal shifts over time throughout the Iberian Peninsula. And moving back in time a little bit, but still when there's some of these saber-toothed predators around, like Nimravis, we are looking at things like the White River group in North America. And specifically, the taphonomic rhesus, essentially the fossilization raisins, that we do get soft tissue from these localities at times. A lot of these soft tissues are very small things like, hey, here's the actual cellular structures that existed in the bone beforehand, so it's not like you're getting entire feathers preserved, for example. However, it is still very interesting, and what they found is there's not really any single control that causes this kind of preservation. Regardless of whether the animal was a reptile or a bird or a mammal, they all seem to have that, also irregardless of what environment they were preserved in. So if you have sand dune deserts that are very dry, sometimes you get these little soft tissue preservations. If it's a river system, you get these soft tissue preservations. Basically, no matter what fossil it is, it does have these at least some of the time. What this then also likely means is we're probably overlooking a lot of this type of preservation in the fossil record. We could probably look at a lot of other fossils and find even more things like this. But as for soft tissue, sometimes there's things that do preserve soft tissue that you don't normally think of as preserving soft tissue. And those are footprints. Because sure, as much as it's largely just the shape, sometimes you do get details of what the animal's skin looked like. And in this case, it's from an early animal in the Permian that was moving onto land. And what we actually find is cornified skin. Cornified essentially just means it's this kind of crosshatch pattern, where it looks kind of like what you would expect to see on a corn on the cob, where, again, similar, it looks like corn. It's pretty straightforward. Based on the shape of the footprint and the time it came from, this was likely from a leptospondyle, which would have been fairly closely related to the amphibians, and when you're thinking of amphibians today, you don't really think of scales in the same kind of way. What this means is that all tetrapods likely had scales, and it's just that the amphibians and the amphibian relatives actually lost them later on. Which is really interesting to think about, because when we're thinking about amphibians, we're going, they're very fish-like, they have slimy skin like fish. Seems like that was something they adopted secondarily, rather than had at the beginning. A few years ago, a Kiyacursor specimen with feathers was found, and it helped show, hey, even ornithischians can have feathers. A second specimen has recently been found, and this time they actually looked at the skin to see what kind of skin they had and what kind of feathers they had. What the researchers found is a mismatch. Essentially, there's some parts of the skin that are very much like what you would expect to see in other reptiles, but then you also have the feathers like you would expect to see in birds, but not the kind of underlying skin that you would expect to find in birds, because birds modified their skin heavily by losing their scales. What this means is there isn't some kind of genetic block for both feathers and scales to exist on the same animal. Instead, they evolved separately, could develop in separate places, and the animal could have a variety of both feathers and scale patches. Now, jumping a bit towards modern animals, but has important implications for the evolution of different groups, there was a paper that was looking at the metabolic cost of giving birth and raising offspring to adulthood. And sure, in many cases, they don't do a lot. You can look at fish where they just dump a ton of eggs and let them kind of go off and hopefully some of them make it. The thing is, though, this paper was able to show even in those fish, there's still a very high cost of producing those offspring. In fact, in most fish, they found about half of the metabolic energy that the animal was producing would go towards producing offspring, which is far more than previously expected. And even in reptiles, that number jumps up to 70%, and then in mammals, it jumps up again to about 90%, which is just a huge amount of energy to put into offspring. But the reptiles one is really interesting for me, I think, because a lot of people don't think about reptiles as protecting or guarding young or caring for their young, when actually they really do. I think one of the most interesting examples of this in reptiles is actually with modern-day rattlesnakes, which when they give birth will sit with their young and protect them until their first shed. They do invest time and care into it. And that's even before actually developing the young inside the body, because they do give live birth. So it's this really interesting concept where, sure, we think about reptiles as not actually investing in the young, but even fish do. So it takes a lot of energy to raise offspring, at least in vertebrates, and hopefully that'll help us to shape our understanding of different evolutionary steps, especially with reproduction and the evolution of reproduction, a little bit better. For many animals to reproduce, it requires laying eggs, and that was true of dinosaurs. And in this paper, they actually looked at a collection of many dinosaur eggs that were found to probably be from something like Allosaurus. Some of the actual embryos inside have been preserved and do seem to resemble Allosaurus, for example, so for all practical purposes, it's Allosaurus or a close relative. However, importantly, they're not necessarily all in the places they would have been when they were nesting. Instead, they're all oriented and have been pushed in the same direction. And that also includes a few crocodile eggs that also got included in this. Essentially, they were all pushed the same direction. What this means is Allosaurus likely nested in very similar areas to modern-day crocodilians, essentially on the shallow edges of banks where it could be moist but not too moist. This likely happened during the dry season when water levels would remain more constant, so that the water wouldn't rise up and bury the eggs and drown the embryos inside. However, importantly, that also means that if there were early rains, like likely happened in this case, it could wash those eggs away entirely, and in this case we were fortunate to get them fossilized, but for the animal itself, that means all that effort of expending and producing these eggs just kind of went to waste. Unfortunate for it, but it's still really useful for understanding Allosaurid nesting behaviors. But of course, that's not true of all theropods. For example, look at birds, where many of them lay their nests in trees. There's a lot of variety in how they nest. What this paper looked at isn't necessarily their nesting behavior, but actually the shape of the femur. What they found is that all of the muscle attachments within many different theropods were basically the same. However, very importantly, as you get closer to birds evolutionarily, those kinds of attachments for those muscles shrink quite a bit. And that makes a good amount of sense because when you're thinking about theropods, sure, it's all femur-driven movement. Essentially, the femur is powering the leg backwards. What you see in birds, though, is the femur stays more or less still, and it's actually the knee that's driving the movement. They walk from the knees, not the femur. So this is really interesting, and it helps to show that there were many steps that actually led to this kind of movement pattern in birds. There was also a look at an irregular iguanodontian femur bone. And what they did is they essentially thin-sectioned it, but they also produced micro-CT scans of the fossil to see what it looked like inside. And what they found is that the medullary cavity, which is essentially where bone growth really starts from, wasn't actually going properly. It's not shaped as regularly as you might expect. And what that means is there was a pathological injury on this femur bone that stunted the bone growth. You can see this in essentially this medullary-like bone cavity that's extending into the injury. And what that means is it's probably stimulating growth there when the injury happened. Unfortunately, though, it essentially overcompensated and kept growing more bone, causing longer-lasting issues for this animal. In fact, this injury could have been its cause of death, because when you're thinking about something trying to move around, it really probably couldn't move around very well, likely had a fairly significant limp, and that would have made it much more prone to predation, or potentially just not being able to find shelter at the right time. As for other large herbivores of the Mesozoic, we're actually going back to the Triassic, and it's not dinosaurs, it's Placerius, a type of dicynodont that's actually closer related to mammals than to dinosaurs. There's the famous Placerius quarry near St. John's, Arizona, where there's been many dozens of these specimens found. These researchers looked at these specimens, and especially their skulls, to see if they could see if there was any dimorphism in this group. And what they found is, yeah, there's definitely dimorphism in this group. The actual little kind of tusks that they have are pointed in entirely different directions. And potentially for the females with the more forward-facing, that might mean they may have been used more for digging up tubers and things like that. Whereas for the males, which are a little bit larger and had more downward-facing tusks, they were more likely used for combat. Importantly though, it's not just the tusks. They did look at other parts of the body and found that there were similar differences in other bones, such as the femurs and the fibula, different parts of the leg bones. So yeah, these animals were pretty dimorphic among the sexes. And if you think of tusks as being like teeth, there's one animal that has many, by far the most number of teeth, and that's sharks. In part because their skin is actually made up of teeny tiny teeth and it helps the water flow over them. However, importantly, this existed before true sharks in the acanthodans. The acanthodans are kind of proto-sharks. They have a lot of the traits, but not necessarily all of the traits that we associate with being sharks. One of these acanthodans, specifically Acanthodes, ironically enough, actually has the entire pharynx preserved. And what this paper did is study that pharynx to try and see how similarly it would have functioned to sharks and other organisms. What they found is that this pharynx would have supported the jaws to open not just very wide as far as vertical space, but also wide as far as lateral space. What this means is Acanthodes was likely filter feeding, and as this was very close to the base of essentially all sharks and chondrichthyes, that is cartilaginous fish, it's very likely that that's how they started. Essentially, they were probably all basically filter feeding, and then eventually they went, hey, if we move these teeth from our skin into our mouth, we can eat bigger things, and that's where you get many of the sharks that you're more accustomed to seeing today. As for other fish, you can actually jump up to the Cretaceous in the Chem beds of northern Morocco. And what these researchers were looking at is the fossil fish Monsonia, which was expected to be this 15-foot long or 5-meter long coelacanth that would have lived in fresh water, very different from modern day coelacanths. This paper used some newer methods, such as the ones used with the Dunkleosteus paper that shrank it, to try and estimate a better length for Monsonia. And what they found is, 15 feet is a little bit overkill. Instead, what they found is probably about 1.2 meters, or around 4 feet in length on average, which is still a pretty good sized fish. They also do state that it could have gone up to about 1.5 meters, so a little closer to 5 feet. But they also again then mention, hey, we really need to study these kinds of techniques a little more and test just how consistent they are, because it's still a little bit up in the air. Sure, it may have been a 15-foot giant, but at least based on this study, it's probably not, and we just need a little bit more testing to really help narrow that down. And as for large animals in the water, you can think of any of the megafauna that existed throughout Earth's history in the oceans. So that can be anything from whales, potentially even seals, depending on where exactly your definition is, but also things like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, just large vertebrates moving back into the water. This paper looked at these different faunas and essentially why they went extinct, what was the cause, and then compared it to the modern day extinctions that we're seeing of things like large whales. What they found is essentially that, hey, we have no idea why these things are going extinct. When we look at the fossil record, we can point to specific events or different changes within the oceans and say, okay, that's likely the cause of extinction for these fossil groups. When we look at the modern day oceans, none of those things are happening. It's really odd that all of these groups are going extinct in the modern day, and that means, it likely is humans that are causing those extinctions. As for some of that megafauna, you can obviously think of things that were hunting some of the other megafauna, such as sharks like the great white shark, but also megalodon. This study used fossil megalodon and great white shark teeth from the Mediterranean Sea to see how much they might have been competing with one another. And what they found is, there's definitely a good amount of overlap, particularly in young individuals. That said, it does seem like Ototus megalodon would have actually been targeting more mammalian prey than the great white shark. The great white shark has different sets of microwear on the teeth than megalodon. What that means is that it's very likely that what was making up the difference in their diets, rather than it being larger, more marine mammals, is that great whites were probably targeting other sharks and large fish more than megalodon was. And of course, if you're thinking about megalodon, you're thinking about how wide it could open up its jaws, large enough for a person to get through. But there's other animals in the oceans that seemingly could open their mouths pretty wide. However, these aren't the ones you'd be thinking of because it's actually brachiopods. Brachiopods are clam-like animals that live in the oceans, although not directly related to clams. They have different symmetries and just different organs, such as lophophores. And that's what helps them to filter feed in the modern day. However, really importantly, most of them don't really live in muddy areas because that can clog the lophophore. The strophometids, however, definitely did that. They, in fact, actually hung out in the water quite a bit. What this paper looked at is potentially how that might have functioned. And what they did is first try to figure out how wide they could actually open up their gape to bring water in. What they found is that it was minimum 45 degrees, and likely up to as much as 65 degrees, which is a massive gape for something very similarly built to a clam. This group of brachiopods is also interesting because instead of having their shell be shaped more like this, where essentially they're opening here, they instead have a cupped system, which means they're opening from here. However, they wouldn't be facing with that domed part up. What it seems like actually happened, and this is especially true of the producted brachiopods, where they had large spines that would have helped anchor them into the soil, they actually would have had that dome facing downwards. That means when they opened up, that curved part of the top shell would actually push mud and sand off of the shell so that they could actually suck in water a little bit more easily. It also means when they closed back down, that internal force of the shell going into their own body would help shove water out and push mud away from where they were actually feeding. This seems really minor, but there's been a lot of debate as to how these brachiopods actually functioned in their environment and why we find them in so many muddy places. And it just happens to turn out that they have very unique morphologies that made them perfectly adapted for these kinds of muddy environments. And if you want to know more about brachiopods, there is also an update to the treatise on invertebrate paleontology, which is essentially a, hey, we're going to look at every single invertebrate fossil and categorize them and give you better instructions on how to identify them. And the brachiopod volume just came out. I'm pretty sure it's open access, so you can check that out if you are more interested in them. They're pretty common fossils, so it might be interesting to find regardless. And then we can jump back even further to before the Cambrian and the Ediacaran, where this paper is essentially looking at, okay, well, if these are fronds and other organisms starting to stick up into the water column, why? And could they actually change the flow of the water in order to feed more efficiently? I really think the graphical abstract is great at explaining this. We're showing, hey, look, there's these water flows going through here, and they're starting to mix up quite a bit more. This seems minor as well, but when you're thinking about different waters moving around and mixing, that also means oxygen and other gases are starting to get mixed in there. That increased oxygen could potentially have led to things like the Cambrian explosion, as there's just more oxygen in the water, so more life can develop. Many of these Ediacaran fossils are really hard to identify because they're basically just on flat slabs of rock. This paper actually looked at some of these flat slabs of rock, but not necessarily with Ediacaran fossils, with more modern groups, such as certain insects, and used flatbed scanners to really see the different details that could have existed there. And you can see that in some of these images, where you're able to see a more three-dimensional type image of some of these fossils and what they likely looked like during life. This has the potential to be a really, really great tool, and hopefully we'll see it used more in the future. And as for some of those flat fossils, in this case you have a iridescent Opiliones, which Opiliones are often called harvestmen or sometimes daddy longlegs despite not being spiders. And where I grew up, daddy longlegs are very specifically cellar spiders. So, just different names for different things. However, I love these guys. They are very, very interesting. They're chelicerates, closely related to spiders, and they also have a lot of diversity. In this case, though, this one's interesting because it comes from the Eocene of Germany, and there's also similar iridescent species coming from slightly later, coming from the Baltics, fossilized in amber. These kinds of close connections of these iridescent harvestmen hopefully will be studied more in the future so we can really understand the biogeographical history of this group. And if you go back far enough, there were also other arachnids around, and this one goes back as far as the Mason Creek Lagerstadt in the Pennsylvanian part of the late Carboniferous. And Mason Creek is actually just outside of Chicago, but this fossil is entirely new and unique, and that's because it's a very spiny-legged arachnid. Douglasarachne acanthopoda is this new arachnid, and helps to show the broad diversity of different organisms that would have been around during the late Carboniferous in this part of Illinois. This is also really interesting because it just shows how rapidly the arachnids started to diversify once they got onto land, and larger ecosystems started to develop on land. It also is very spiny, which suggests it's probably trying not to get eaten by something, which, if you're going to be crunching down on something, that's likely going to be a vertebrate predator, as opposed to something more like an insect, or potentially even a spider. Because a spider is not necessarily going to be, hey, there's spikes here, I need to be careful where I bite, because it's biting such a small area. Meanwhile, something like Tiktaalik would have needed to be careful, because it doesn't want to impale its mouth. That implies that in Mason Creek, there were potentially terrestrial predators already existing on the land. The kind of burst in diversity shown by Douglasarachne really helps to suggest certain things about evolution, namely punctuated equilibrium. Essentially, there's two competing, but also sometimes coexisting hypotheses for evolution. And that's gradualism, where organisms undergo very slight changes over very, very long periods of time, and that's just always what's happening, and that's how different species arise. The other idea is punctuated equilibrium, where a species is in stasis. It largely goes unchanged for a long period of time, and then something changes in the environment. And that means that different individuals are able to become more successful very rapidly. And that changes the entire population and evolves it into something different than what it was before in a very dramatic way. We actually see this a lot of times with smaller fossils. Things like certain kinds of snails can show, hey, this population very suddenly changed entirely and eventually took over the entire parent population. It's really interesting. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but this paper essentially looks at punctuated equilibrium and goes, hey, look, we have this idea, it's existed for a while, and we have all these great ideas on how it can be applied to other things like social sciences and such. And there's a lot that's going on there. It's very smart, and they are very smart, but I'm not entirely sold on being able to apply it to all of these other parts of science. But also, those aren't my fields of science, so that's probably part of it. And finally, we come to a paper that I've already talked about in an entire separate video, and that is the size of the largest belemnites. Belemnites were squid-like cephalopods coming from the Mesozoic, and they had these little kind of pointy tips at the end of them, and you can find plenty of these. However, certain fossils from France actually have soft tissue preserved. From that, they were able to reconstruct how long the point and some of the soft tissues of these points would have actually been shaped and how that would have related to the entire length of the organism. Then applying that to the largest of the belemnites, Megateuthis, they were able to estimate a size of up to 9 feet or over 3 meters for the largest of the belemnites. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. As you may have figured out, we had a lot going on over the last bit, which is why it is May and we're getting this out hopefully in July, if not early August, and then immediately turning around and popping out June and then July. Anyway, hopefully we'll be doing a video in the future of something that I'm on, where my name will be on the screen. Yay! So lots of cool science going on, not just with me, but with a lot of other people as well. And hopefully we'll be able to get some more stuff out here as well. We also have an interview recorded that I'm really excited to hopefully get out in the near future. With all that said, be safe everyone, take care. Do not go extinct. Oh, my entire body just popped. Ow.